Hello and welcome. This video is going to be about creating Windows virtual machines on a Hyper-V server. So I've got my Hyper-V manager up here. That's the tool that we're going to use to manage Hyper-V and all the virtual machines and settings that are created when we create a virtual machine in Hyper-V. So if you haven't figured out where this is on your computer yet, it's pretty easy. You just are going to click down on the Windows flag, start typing in Hyper-V Manager. It's going to come up, assuming that you have the Hyper-V role installed. If you don't have that installed yet, see my other standard operating procedure on how to set up a Hyper-V host for that. Okay, so we're starting with a blank slate here. We don't have any virtual machines set up. So I'm just going to walk us through the process of creating a virtual machine, talk a little bit about the steps, and go over some best practices. So to create a virtual machine, we're just going to go over here to the New button, click New, and click Virtual Machine. Hit Next. Alright, we need to give our virtual machine a name, so I'm just going to call this one Test. What I recommend here, though, when you're doing these in production, is to stick with the standardized naming scheme. So for instance, if we were at Griffin Transportation, I might name my machines Griffin, and then if it's a file server, maybe FS01. If it was a domain controller, I might do DC01. Then if I have two domain controllers or maybe a second file server down the road, it's pretty easy to determine which one is which. They're also easy to iterate if we're doing newer versions. Later on, maybe down the road, we do FS03, FS04, things of that nature. So, and for right now, I'm just going to call this Test. Hopefully down here, you've already set your paths correctly. Again, my other previous standard operating procedure document talks about setting those up when you're installing the Hyper-V role. On my laptop here, I'm just storing them on the C drive because I don't actually have a second drive to store the Hyper-V data on. But for you, this path should look something like maybe D drive or E drive, and then the folder that you want to store your stuff in. And hit Next here. Okay, Generation 1 versus Generation 2. This is applicable if you're running newer versions of the Windows operating system, such as Windows Server 2012 R2 and later, or Windows 8.1 or later. You have the option of choosing Generation 2. Generation 2 allows you to do some cool things with secure boot, UEFI booting instead of legacy BIOS, and then also using a SCSI controller for the disk of the boot drive versus a emulated IDE controller. So if you are using later versions of the operating system, meaning you're not trying to install something like Windows Server 2008, hopefully you're not doing that in these days, you can choose Generation 2, and I do recommend you choose Generation 2 when applicable. It'll boot faster. It'll just have a lot more options available to you. So we're going to go ahead and pick Generation 2 for this. This is the amount of memory that we want to assign to the VM. Keep in mind that you need to have enough VM or memory on your host here for whatever you decide to do. The other checkbox here that is pre-selected by default is dynamic memory. What dynamic memory means is that the amount of memory in the virtual machine or allocated to the virtual machine can be changed by the host. So if the VM is not doing anything, if it's sitting idle, it may ramp the amount of memory allocated to the VM down. And if the VM is very busy processing an intense workload, it can ramp that memory back up by a process that's called ballooning. Dynamic memory is really useful if you're kind of on a tight RAM budget on your host and you just barely have enough RAM to run. Otherwise, I say usually just turn this off. If you're well provisioned on RAM, just give the machine how much RAM you think it needs right at startup. So for this instance, we're going to do 4 gigs of RAM. This is in megabytes, so you have to do a conversion to gigabytes if you want to figure that out. Pretty easy math. Take the value times 1024. We're going to do next here. So now we have to decide on a network connection. I just have one virtual switch set up. Again, if you haven't set up a virtual switch yet, see my other guide on how to set up a Hyper-V server. We go over how to do a virtual switch. I just have one default switch, so I'll pick that one. And then now I have to create a hard drive. So this hard drive is actually where the operating system is going to be installed. You can see it's got my path pre-selected there. It's going to name it whatever I named the virtual machine. What I recommend here is leave this name, but then give it a -OS to remind us, if we're looking at it in the file system, that this drive contains the operating system. So we may add another drive later that contains just data and no operating system. You can call that drive, test-data or something of that nature. This is going to automatically create a dynamically expanding hard disk, which is fine for a drive. I'm just going to size this at 100 gig. That's a good default usually for most OS drives, unless you have a machine that has a ton of RAM. If you have a virtual machine that's going to have a lot of RAM, you need to think about your page file size for Windows and make sure that you size your OS drive big enough to accommodate that page file. I'm going to hit next. This is where we choose how to install our operating system. So in almost every instance when you're doing a VM, you're going to be installing from an ISO file, which I happen to have here. So I'm going to pick this option. You usually will too. And then I'm going to browse. I have a shortcut to an ISO folder on my desktop, and I'm going to pick 2019 Windows Server here. So this ISO is an ISO of Windows Server 2019. That's what we want to install here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next, and then I'm going to hit finish. Now, I am not going to start this machine yet because I want to show you a couple of other things. So here's my test VM. It's been created. I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to choose Settings. One thing that isn't set in the wizard that is pretty important, depending on what performance level you want, is the number of processors. These are virtual processors, so virtual cores, not physical cores. But it's going to always start at 1. Now, for most machines, that's pretty minimal. And most of the time, they're going to want more than that. I usually always recommend 2 cores. If it's a beefier machine, maybe a SQL Server or something like that, you may want to go with 4. You may even want to go with 6 or 8. Since this is just a laptop, and I don't have a ton of resources to play with here, I'm going to go with 2. There you can see my memory allocation. Turn dynamic memory off. Here's my OS drive. Notice it's on a SCSI controller because this is the Gen 2 VM. So I've got 2 virtual cores, I've got 4 gigs of RAM, I've got my 100 gig OS drive, and I've got my ISO file already hooked up there with my virtual DB drive. I've also got my network adapter here connected to my default switch. One of the other things that you want to check here or just be aware of is that the default actions for starting and stopping the VM are restarted if it was previously running, which is a good default. Automatic stop action is to save the state of the virtual machine. That usually doesn't result in too good of a restart process because it's like kind of hibernating the virtual machine. So I usually change this to shut down the guest machine. That means if I shut this physical computer down, what do I want to happen to this VM? And typically if I'm shutting the virtual or the actual server down, I would want this virtual machine to cleanly shut down. So I'm going to hit shut down the guest operating system. Okay, those are all the defaults I usually like to adjust here. I'm going to hit apply and hit OK. I'm going to right click on this guy and connect, and then we're going to start it up, and we're going to start watching the OS install. So this turns the VM on. I'll start it up here. And you'll see it start to boot here. Okay, and I'm going to hit the key. Oh, you know what? It booted so fast that I missed my key press. I've got my hand on the keyboard right now. So I'm going to restart this guy. Actually, just turn it off. Back up. Turn it off. I'm ready this time. Okay, got it. These Gen 2 VMs boot super fast, so you have to be ready with that keyboard press to get into the OS installer here. So this is booting from my ISO file. You see my Windows Server 2019 here. So I'm just going to pick my language, which is obviously English. I'm all set here. Hit next, install now. It's going to go through loading some of the files and then bring me to the installation screen. The process of installing Windows Server these days is pretty simple. There's not a lot of buttons to click. You just have to pick the drive and then let it do its thing for you. Okay, I am going to pick 2019 Standard with the desktop experience. This version here does not include a GUI, so if you are a PowerShell wizard and want to rely on only command line and PowerShell, go for it. The rest of us, we need a desktop. So I'm going to click next on here, accept the license terms, and then I'm going to install on my 100 gig drive here. Notice it's already formatted, that's the only drive I have. So I'm going to hit next. Alright, at this point it's going to install Windows Server from my ISO file. This is all SSD-based workflow, so this actually should be pretty fast. But I'm just going to go ahead and pause the video here, and we'll come back to it when it's all set. Okay, we're back, and this VM has finished installing its operating system, so now we're here at the administrator prompt, the familiar startup process for a new Windows Server installation, so I am just going to enter a secure password here and take finish. So at this point now we are into the virtual machine. And we'll log in. Oops. Check that again here. And then we will be off to the races in terms of configuring this Windows VM. So this Windows VM is now in a state just like any other newly installed Windows Server would be, whether it's physical or virtual. Notice there it's connecting this to the network. So it's got an IP from DHCP. It doesn't have its time zone set probably to Eastern time. It has some wacky name, just like any new server would have, and it's ready to be configured. So depending on what needs to happen next with this server, we would name it, maybe join it to a domain, set a static IP, install some software, and etc, etc, etc. So this is the point at which I can't exactly tell you what to do next. What you do next will depend a lot on your environment that you're working in and what type of server this is going to be. But we now have this server spun up on our Hyper-V host, and it is ready to be used. So I'm just going to close out of Server Manager. You'll see these buttons at the top. They can invoke actions on the VM. You can obviously shut it down from inside here too, but we've got a button up here, this little red button that would shut down the VM. So that sends the shutdown signal. You can see there it's shutting down. And it actually should turn off fairly quickly because it doesn't have a lot in it right now. There you can see it's off. So you can hear it as our virtual machine. As you add more of these, you obviously will see the names here. And then we've got some stats down here about what it is. Notice right here, generation version 2. We chose that when we were setting it up. One thing that's important about choosing the generation is that you cannot change it later. It actually writes a virtual machine configuration file in the generation 2 format that isn't compatible with the generation 1 format. So if you set up a virtual machine as a Gen 2 virtual machine and then later you find out your software manufacturer doesn't support Gen 2 VMs or something of that nature and you need to redo it in Gen 1, you're going to actually have to recreate the VM. You can still use the VHD that you created in this instance. So this file that we looked at earlier, if we go to settings right here, this file right here called TestOS, right there, that file would still be usable with the machine, but you would have to go through the whole process of creating a new VM. And just when you get to the point where you tell it about the hard drive, you could attach this existing hard drive. So Gen 2 versus Gen 1, pretty important. Again, Gen 2 only works for newer operating systems, such as Windows Server 2012 R2 and later, or Windows 8.1 and later, as well as a few select Linux virtual machines that I think are compatible with Gen 2. But again, only newer operating systems are compatible with that version. Okay, that's a wrap for this video. This has been just how to get a Windows VM set up on your Hyper-V host. Hope you enjoyed it.